For almost 50 years, the United States and the Soviet Union had the entire world caught in a nuclear standoff. It was terrifying. But here's the strange part. They never actually declared war on each other. So, how in the world did they fight the most dangerous conflict in human history? Well, we're about to open the Proxy files. I mean, think about that question. It was the central, terrifying problem of the entire era. Both Washington and Moscow knew that if they went head-to-head, it would mean mutually assured destruction. Game over. For everyone. So they had to get creative. They had to find a different way to play the game. A way to push their ideologies without pushing the big red button. And there it is. That's the secret sauce of a proxy war. This wasn't a fight with clear battle lines drawn across Europe. No, this was a shadow war, fought across the entire globe, in jungles, in mountains, in deserts. The superpowers would foot the bill, they'd send the weapons, they'd fly in the advisors, but it was the people of those other nations who did the actual fighting and dying. The whole world basically became one giant chessboard. The US and the USSR were the two grandmasters, and entire countries were treated like pawns in a game, where the stakes couldn't have been higher. So let's take a look at the two different rulebooks they were playing from. It really all came down to two completely opposite ways of seeing the world. For the United States, it was all about containment. The idea that communism was a disease that had to be quarantined and stopped from spreading no matter the cost. On the other side, you had the Soviet Union, driven by this mission of world revolution, this deep belief that capitalism was doomed and it was their job to help history along. These two ideas were destined to clash, and they'd set the world on fire for decades. To really get the American mindset at the time, you have to understand this right here, the domino theory. Inside the US, the fear of communism was everywhere, and policymakers in Washington genuinely saw the world as a line of dominoes. If Vietnam fell, then Cambodia would fall, then Thailand, and so on. Their entire foreign policy was built around stopping that first domino from tipping over, wherever it might be. But, Moscow was looking at a completely different map. They saw themselves as the champions of the little guy on a mission they called proletarian internationalism. Fancy term, but what it meant was this. They would actively support revolutionary movements anywhere in the world. They wanted to help these new nations break free from what they saw as Western control, this idea that even after independence, the West was still pulling the strings economically. Okay, so the rules are set, the players are in position. Let's open our first case file, Korea. This is the place where the Cold War stopped being cold and got brutally hot really, really fast. So here's the setup. After World War II, Korea gets split right down the middle. In 1950, the Soviet-backed North invades the South. For the US, this was a critical test. They were terrified of repeating the mistakes of the 1930s with Hitler. The Soviets, for their part, wanted to help their communist allies, but they were desperate to avoid a direct slugfest with America, so they did it all covertly. The end result? 3 years of brutal fighting and a draw. A total stalemate that left the country divided, a division that's still frozen in time today. But here's the real cost of that draw. While the superpowers patted themselves on the back for avoiding World War III, over 2.5 million Korean civilians were killed or wounded. A strategic stalemate for the big guys was an absolute national catastrophe for Korea. Korea was the first bloody test, but believe me, the game was about to get a whole lot scarier. The stakes were raised, moving the fight right into America's backyard, and then dragging it into a jungle quagmire on the other side of the world. And this all happened with breathtaking speed. First, Castro's revolution puts a communist state just off the coast of Florida. Then, a botched US-backed invasion pushes Cuba straight into the arms of the Soviets. And then, in October 1962, the world just stops. The USSR puts nuclear missiles on the island. The US throws a naval blockade around it. And for 13 days, everyone, and I mean everyone, just held their breath, waiting to see if the world would end. And that's not hyperbole. That is a fact. This was the moment the whole proxy war strategy almost backfired in the most catastrophic way imaginable. A standoff over this one piece on the chessboard, Cuba, nearly ended the entire game for everybody. It was a terrifying lesson in just how fast these little proxy conflicts could spin out of control. The tragic thing about Vietnam is that it started as a local fight for independence from France, but it got sucked into the vortex of the Cold War. For the US, it was the next big domino they were obsessed with keeping upright. For the Soviets and the Chinese, it was a golden opportunity. They could supply their allies, sit back, and watch the American military get bled dry in a jungle war it couldn't win. And the result, as we all know, was a humiliating defeat for America that changed how it saw itself and its role in the world.
And there it is again, the same horrifying pattern. While the superpowers were calculating their strategic gains and losses, over 2 million Vietnamese civilians died. Their country, their homes, their fight for independence, it all just became a stage for a drama being directed by two very distant empires.
All right, for our final case file, the tables completely turn. Now it's the Soviet Union that gets caught in a nightmare war it can't win. And you can bet the United States was right there on the sidelines, more than happy to help make that nightmare a reality.
So, 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan to prop up a friendly communist government that's falling apart. The US sees this and thinks, payback. Through a massive covert program called Operation Cyclone, the CIA started funneling weapons, like shoulder-fired Stinger missiles, to the Afghan rebels. The plan was brutally simple: give the Soviets their very own Vietnam. And, well, it worked. The war became what was called a bleeding wound that helped bankrupt the USSR. But, and this is a huge but, it left behind a power vacuum that was eventually filled by groups like the Taliban. And for the third time in our files, we see the real price of these games. Over 1 million Afghan civilians died. Their country was completely shattered, all in service of a strategic goal set in a faraway capital, leaving scars that are still visible today. The Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union dissolved. It's easy to think the story ends there, but it doesn't. The ghosts of these proxy wars are very much still with us, right here, right now. So what's the legacy we're living with? First, all the stuff of war, the guns, the mines, the spy networks, it didn't just vanish. It's still out there fueling conflicts today. Second, it taught the world a really dangerous lesson, that international politics is a zero-sum game, where for me to win, you absolutely have to lose. And most troublingly, that proxy logic, the whole idea of using other countries as a chessboard, well, it's making a comeback. We're seeing this thinking pop up again in conflicts from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. Which all leads to one final, really tough question. For over 40 years, the superpowers didn't nuke each other. Some historians actually call this period the Long Peace. But having looked at the cost, the millions of lives lost in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, you have to ask yourself, was it really peace? Or was it just a global tragedy that was outsourced, shifted onto the shoulders of the rest of the world?